all y'all, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carrie, and here's where I talk about knitting, my preferences, my opinions, my tips, and my tricks. I'm very excited for today's video because I'm starting a whole new series about knitting fundamentals. So if you want to find out more about what this is, stay tuned. Confession, this is actually the third time I'm shooting this video. The past two times were cursed. I think there was a curse on me or something. Maybe it's just the beginning of this new year. There's bad mojo in the universe. But I had technical difficulties with both of the last ones. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to do a whole new outfit. And I'm going to just reshoot the whole thing for a third time. Because I just want to present the best possible footage that I can for a one-woman show. And this is a one-woman show. I plan, I shoot, and I edit all this myself. So, you know, if you are a subscriber and you've been wondering, where has this video been? Or if you have seen me on social media talking about how, hey, on this day, I'm going to be uploading this video all about, you know, how to get started in knitting. And you're like, where is it? That's why there's been a big delay. And I apologize. It's just, you know, this has been a very interesting time. On top of everything else, I have the flu. In fact, the second time I shot this video, I was coming down with the flu and didn't realize it while I was shooting. And this is like the first morning where I woke up where I'm like, I think I can actually shoot today. So anyway, let's do this. It's 2020. We made it. And a lot of people I've been seeing online saying they want to learn how to knit in 2020. Well, this is a great series of videos for you to start following because it's all about knitting fundamentals. And the way I'm approaching this is like a beginner's class. So I'm going to start right at the basics of how you pick your supplies, and then we'll learn how to cast on, knit, purl, and go through that whole process of how to learn how to knit. Now, if you're an experienced knitter, I still think this series of videos is going to have a lot of useful information for you because I'm not going to just explain how to knit. I'm also going to talk about the why of how we do things, the knit theory of knitting fundamentals. The way I plan to do this right now is that on Mondays, I'm going to upload a new video in the Knitting Fundamentals series, and then Fridays will be a bit more of a grab bag of other types of videos that I like to do. If you're interested in this, please hit subscribe and the notification bell, which will let you know whenever I upload a new video. I know when I learned how to knit, I knew nothing. I only knew that I would need yarn and some knitting needles. And I had always heard my grandmother talking about getting worsted weighted yarn. So I'm like, I'll get some worsted weighted yarn. So I went to a chain craft store. I found some yarn that said worsted weight. I liked the color. And I was like, I'll buy that ball of yarn. And I looked at the ball and there's a label that will give a recommended needle size. So I was like, okay, this says I need needle size 7. So I bought a pair of size 7 needles. You can absolutely take this approach when going to buy your first ball of yarn and knitting needles. However, if I knew then what I know now, I would have made some different choices in terms of what ball of yarn I got and maybe even the needle size that I taught myself to knit with. So with that in mind, I'm going to give you some very basic information about yarn and needles and notions to help get you started on building your first knitting kit. As always, in the description box, I will have timestamps down below so you can skip around to any portion of the video that you're interested in. And let's talk about knitting. There's 3 places that you can buy supplies for knitting. You can go to a local yarn store, colloquially called an LYS. You can go online. There's lots of online retailers these days. I'm going to give you some links in the description box to some good ones to check out. And you can go to a chain craft store. All of these places have their advantages and their disadvantages in terms of buying materials. I will say going to a local yarn store is a great idea when you're first learning how to knit. Not only can the shop person help direct you to the right ball of yarn to get for yourself and a nice pair of knitting needles, they are a fountain of information. They will probably also offer beginning knitting classes if you're interested in that. However, not everyone has an LYS in their area that they can go to easily. And if that's you, there are still great options at the chain craft store and online. So let's imagine ourselves walking into a chain craft store and there's needles and notions and rows of yarn, and it's kind of overwhelming. What do you want to look for in your first ball of yarn? So yarn comes in what are called different weights. There is worsted weighted yarn. This is also called medium or a size 4 yarn. You have, let's see, over here, I have super bulky yarn. And you have this. This is a fingering weight sock yarn. So, and these are just 3 sizes of yarns. There are other sizes of yarns as well. All of these are different sizes of yarn, so they all need a different size of knitting needle to work with. So when you first learn how to knit, what weight of yarn should you look for? Personally, I recommend just getting a nice worsted weighted yarn. It's going to produce big enough stitches so that you can clearly see the work, but you're not going to have to work on such a large needle that it feels cumbersome in the hand. It's just a nice middle of the road weight of yarn, and a lot of projects are designed to work with worsted weighted yarn. There's basically 3 broad categories of fiber in knitting. You have animal-based fibers, which are generally called wools. You have plant fibers, which are cotton, linen, bamboo, and then you have synthetic fibers, which most of the time is going to be acrylic. Right off the bat, I'm going to say that there are certain qualities to plant-based fibers that is a little much to get into with this video, but because of the nature of cotton, linen, bamboo, etc., they can be a little bit harder on the hands. They cause more hand fatigue, and they aren't as forgiving a fiber. And by as forgiving, I mean that if you make a mistake in your knitting with cotton, you're going to see it right away because cotton creates a very crisp stitch definition. And so whatever mistakes you might make are just really in your face. For a first-time knitter, that can be kind of discouraging. So when you're first learning how to knit, we want to build up your confidence. That being said, if for some reason, whether you environmentally don't like synthetic fibers or ethically you're against animal fibers, plant-based fibers are perfectly fine to work with, and you're going to be able to learn how to knit very well with this. When you go to the big chain craft stores, what you find on the shelf mostly is acrylic yarn, 100% acrylic yarn. Acrylic yarn is basically spun plastic, and it was developed to mimic wool yarns. Truth be told, knitters can be a little snobby when it comes to fibers. I am not snobby when it comes to acrylic yarn. Acrylic yarn, when I first started knitting, the quality was but I have to say in the last 20 years, they've come a long way. They can be very soft, they can be very durable, and it's inexpensive. The reason I don't recommend 100% acrylic yarn is really because when you finish knitting, you go through a finishing process. And part of that is washing and blocking your knits. I'm not going to get into depth with this, but just suffice it to say, blocking is a process that gives your knitting its final shape. And how you have to go about washing and blocking your finished product with 100% acrylic is not the same as working with more natural fibers like plant and wool. And because of that, I just think 100% acrylic yarn is less than ideal for first-time knitters. In the chain craft stores, you should be able to find a wool and acrylic blend, and I would recommend that over 100% acrylic. And that actually can be a really nice sweet spot in terms of kind of getting the best of both worlds between synthetic and animal fibers. If for health reasons or ethical reasons you don't want any wool in your yarn, 100% acrylic yarn is perfectly nice to work with when you're first learning how to knit. It's just how you're going to do some of your finishing work will be different than if you're working with more natural fibers. Last, but definitely not least, is what I recommend for first-time knitters, which is just a nice 100% wool yarn. Now, wool actually is a broad category of animal-based fibers. It can come from sheep, rabbits, goats, camels, llamas, alpacas, dogs, cats. Some people get spinners to make yarn out of their dogs and their cats' fur. To each their own. When you're shopping for commercial yarn, usually what you're going to find is sheep-based wool. And if you see a ball that's labeled as 100% wool, that's going to be just a nice, generic, basic bitch lamb-based wool. It is. 100% wool is your vanilla latte of wool. It's great for first-time knitters because wool is what knitting was designed to work with. It feels nice in the hand. It's forgiving. It's forgiving on your hands and it's forgiving in your work. And it's just a delight to work with. And it smells really nice. There's nothing like the scent of 100% wool. Trust me. Anyway, 100% wool yarn, you don't find this as often in the larger chain craft stores. I am seeing it more and more, which I think is very impressive, that the larger yarn manufacturers are starting to put out 100% wool yarn in the larger chain craft stores. But at the same time, it can be a little trickier to find. You'll have no problem finding economical choices online, however. If you would like some specific recommendations of some common wool fiber that you can find at a great price point, check out my blog. I know for myself, color is one of the big things that really draws me in to a ball of yarn, sometimes to my detriment, truth be told. When buying your first ball of yarn, I really recommend that you get a light color of yarn. When you first start learning how to knit, you really want to see your stitches clearly, and the darker the yarn, the harder it is to see your stitches. So you really want to stick with whites, creams, pastels, light grays, and stick with a nice solid color of yarn. The reason is, even this is a heathered yarn, so it's gray, but it has dark and light gray fibers blended together. Even a heathered yarn like this can make it just a little bit more difficult to see your stitches. The other thing you want to look at when picking a ball of yarn is the structure of the yarn itself. The way that yarn is manufactured is they take fiber and they spin it together, and that makes a ply. And you do have single plies of yarn that are on the market. The problem with single ply yarn is it doesn't have as much structure and it can be a little trickier to work with for a first-time knitter. Most yarn, however, is a plied yarn. So they take several of those plies and then twist them together. That's what you want. You want a plied yarn, and you want a plied yarn that has a nice round structure like this that holds itself together well. If you were to try to untwist it, it would take some work to do it. That means it has a nice twist to it. Again, it's going to have more structure. It's going to hold together better for you. And notice this yarn, it's nice and even throughout. There are yarns on the market that are called thick thin, and what that means is the spinner, when they spin the fibers together, allow for thick sections and thin sections. And those can be really fun to work with, but not great for a first-time knitter. So when buying your first ball of yarn, what you want to look for is a nice worsted weighted yarn. You want a yarn that is a nice, light, solid color, that has a nice, round, consistent shape to it, and is ideally 100% wool or a wool acrylic blend. That being said, if for health or ethical reasons you don't want to work with animal fibers, acrylic or plant-based fibers can work very nicely too. One last thing about picking out your ball of yarn. Yarn comes packaged in different manners. You have this, which is called a skein of yarn. You have this, which is called a cake of yarn. And you have this here. This is called a ball of yarn. Okay, there we go, a ball, an actual ball of yarn. You'll also see this here. This is also a skein of yarn. Any one of these packagings is really good for a first-time knitter because the yarn is already wound for you and you're gonna be able to take off the ball band and just start knitting. What you want to avoid is this. This is called a hank of yarn, and this is unwound. And the thing with hanks is they are meant to be wound into a ball or a cake after you've purchased them, just before you're ready to use them. However, for first-time knitters, you don't have the equipment most likely to wind this into a nice cake or ball of yarn, and doing it by hand is really cumbersome. When you're first learning how to knit, I would just go ahead and avoid hanks of yarn and stick with balls, skeins, or cakes of yarn. Just stick with the skeins. Stick with the skeins. Stick with the skeins. Stick with the skeins. You picked out your first ball of yarn. Now you need to get a pair of knitting needles to work with that yarn. As I mentioned earlier, knitting needles come in different sizes. So, how do you know what size needle to buy to work with your ball of yarn? Well, let me introduce you to your best friend, the ball band. The ball band comes with a lot of useful information, and if you are buying your yarn online, the information that would be on your ball band will be in the yarn description. What you're going to find on a ball band is you're going to see what fiber it's made out of, you're going to see what weight it is, you'll see how much yarn comes in that ball of yarn. You'll get washing instructions, which are really important to pay attention to. You'll also see this. This is a lot number. Yarn, when it's manufactured, gets dyed in batches. And when they run out of a batch, they have to make up a new batch of that dye. And there can be slight differences between each batch of yarn. So they give you a lot number so that you can buy your yarn all from one lot so you have consistent color. This is more important when you're doing larger projects, but just know that this is something you find on the ball band. The ball band will tell you what the ideal gauge for the yarn is and the recommended needle size or sizes to achieve that gauge. All of these weights of yarn have what is considered an ideal gauge. Gauge is how many stitches per inch that you knit through a combination of the yarn and the size of the knitting needle. So this yarn here says that it is 4.5 to 5 stitches equals 1 inch, and you should achieve that on a size 6 to 9 needle. Let me just quickly go over needle sizing. Needles come in different sizes. However, throughout the world, there are different systems to indicate what the size of the needle is. In the United States, we use a sequential numbering system. It actually starts at 000, which is a tiny, tiny needle meant to knit on tiny, tiny yarn. And it goes 000, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. However, a large portion of the world is a lot smarter, and they just indicate the size of the needle in millimeters. The US sizing system, let me just pull out this needle here. The US sizing system, the numbers do correspond to a millimeter size, so when you buy a set of needles, you will see that it says 7 US 4.5 millimeters. So, yeah. And if you're in the UK, you also have a numbering system, but you use a different set of numbers than the US does. So, what is it with the US and UK? I don't know why we do this to ourselves. We should just use millimeters. I wish I could get my brain to start thinking in terms of millimeters. I feel like it would save me some headache. But anyway. All right. One thing to be aware of with gauge. Like I said, I defined gauge as the stitches per inch that you achieve through the combination of the yarn and needle. However, what gauge that you achieve with your needle and your yarn is highly personal to the knitter. And that's because we are not machines. Knitters, this is hand knitting, and some knitters are loose knitters, some knitters are tight knitters. So, you know, Carolyn over here, she might need a size 7 needle in order to get 5 stitches per inch, whereas Henrietta over here, she needs a size 6 needle to achieve that same gauge. So it gives you a range of needles. For you, the first time knitter, you don't know what kind of knitter you are yet. So my recommendation is to just get the biggest needle that's recommended for this yarn. That's going to give you a stitch that's large enough for you to see, but not a needle size that's so large that it's cumbersome to work with. What more could there possibly need to know about needles? Are you kidding me? So first thing to know about knitting needles is there are actually 3 types of knitting needles. What you probably think about when you imagine knitters is this. This is a straight knitting needle. It has a tip on this end and a stopper on this end. Straight knitting needles come in different sizes. This is a 14-inch knitting needle, but you do also find 10-inch knitting needles, straight knitting needles. So there you go. The nice thing about straight needles is that they are everywhere. They're very easy to find, and you can find them very inexpensively. And these will work just great for first-time knitters. The next type of knitting needle that you will see on the market is this. This is a double-pointed needle. It's a straight needle that has a point on either end. DPNs are made to work in the round, which means you're knitting an actual tube. Knitting a tube on a straight needle, there's a way to do it, but it's that's next level. DPNs are not hard to work with, but there's definitely a learning curve. And even longtime knitters will look at DPNs and just be like, I don't know if I want to tackle that. But don't worry, as a first-time knitter, this is not something that you need to worry about. The third type of knitting needle that you find is this. This is a circular needle. No, I don't normally just wear them around my neck as accessories, but for filming, it's a very convenient place to store them. But basically, it's 2 needles that are attached by a cable. What's great about circular needles is you can work with them either flat or in the round. So these are really the most versatile types of needles that you find out on the market. I have a lot more to say about circular needles. These are actually my favorite type of needles to work with. I work with these 98% of the time. However, for first-time knitters, I don't recommend these. Here's why. One, these are a bit more of an investment than straight needles. Inexpensive circular needles, in my experience, have been a nightmare. The main reason that I don't recommend them for first-time knitters is because this cable, circular needles are not hard to work with, but this cable does take some getting used to and how to wrangle. And when you first learn how to knit, you're going to have to build up a lot of muscle memory. You really don't need the added wrinkle of a circular cable in that process. That's why for first-time knitters, my recommendation is to get a 10-inch straight needle. Knitting needles come in a wide array of materials. There's glass, there's plastic, there's wood, there's bamboo. Wood and bamboo are not the same thing. I will get into this. There's metal needles. I'm going to cover the most basic common types of material that you find out on the market. I'm not going to cover every possible material there are. I'm just going to cover what you most commonly see and are at the lowest price point. So what material your knitting needle is made out of affects a lot of things about the needle, but I think the most important, and what I'm going to cover in depth today, has to do with how much grip the needle has. Grippy needles will kind of hold on to the stitch, and you might have to do a little bit more work to push those stitches down the shaft of the needle, but you're able to maintain a lot of control. With grippier needles, your stitches aren't going to just fall off the needle. What you give up with that control, however, is speed. Slicker needles, the stitches just glide right off without hardly any effort from you, and you're able to knit very quickly. The thing is, as a first-time knitter, you really don't need to be concerned with how fast you're knitting, and probably what you need is a bit more control. So, with that in mind, on the scale of grip to slick, the grippiest needle to the slickest needles, where do various materials fall? In my opinion, I haven't done a scientific test, but in my experience and what I have observed from comments online, the grippiest material is bamboo. Bamboo is not a wood. Bamboo is actually a grass, and grass is more fibrous, and so it holds on to the stitches more than even wood needles do. Okay, I'm gonna just admit right now, I don't love working with bamboo. However, many knitters love bamboo needles. They're inexpensive, they like the grip that they have, they're warm, they feel nice in the hand. There's a lot of nice things about bamboo. Next, you have wood needles. Now, you're sitting there going, Carrie, those look the same. Well, wood and bamboo needles can look the same. However, wood needles actually come in a variety of different types of wood. There's rosewood, there's olive wood, there's birch. So some wood needles are slicker than others. That being said, wood needles are very grippy. And again, people love their wood needle. Oh, the other thing with wood needles though, you will find very colorful, beautiful wood needles on the market. And I gotta say, I kind of wish I liked working with wood needles more because they're beautiful. I mean, just gorgeous. But I don't, so it's wasted on me. Next up is plastic needles. Okay, this is a ginormous needle. You use these for like the biggest yarns, the bulkiest yarns. I don't actually use this to knit because I don't actually like working with bulky yarns. I use this for a crochet technique called broomstick lace. In fact, this here is broomstick lace. So that's why I have this in my collection, but I have it here because this is the one plastic straight needle that I have. In the grip to slick scale, I put plastic needles right in the middle. And in some ways, I think this kind of hits the sweet spot in terms of having enough grip for first-time knitters to keep control, but not being so grippy that you feel like you're kind of having to fight to get the stitches to move across the shaft. So I think plastic needles are a great needle to look at when you're a first-time knitter. They're inexpensive. You definitely find these in the large chain craft store. And finally, we get to the slickest material, which is metal. No surprise there. Metal needles come most often in either aluminum, stainless steel, or hollow brass coated needles. And there is a difference in grip between those three materials. I would say aluminum needles, which is what you find at the large chain craft stores, has just a tiniest bit more grip. That being said, these are slick needles. It's not a ton of grip. There's a definite difference between the amount of grip that you find on this, which is minimal, versus plastic, which has, you know, a nice amount of grip, but not too much grip, in my humble opinion. This needle is actually very special to me. This was the first needle I ever bought. I can't find its partner. It's somewhere. I think, you know, if you want metal needles for whatever reason, you can definitely learn how to knit with them and be able to control your stitches. Probably because metal needles were the first ones I worked with, that is my favorite material to work with. So, a lot of things about knitting is about personal preference. And when you first learn how to knit, a large part of that process is actually figuring out what your personal preferences are. But that takes time and experimentation. But when you're first learning how to knit, you're probably going to just buy one set of needles. I personally would recommend either bamboo or plastic needles. They're the least expensive. They have grip. You're going to be able to keep control of your stitches, and that's kind of important when you're a first-time knitter. You have yarn, you have the knitting needles. Technically, you have everything you need to get started with knitting. However, Few other tools called notions that I think is good for a first-time knitter to have at their disposal. So I'm just going to very quickly go through some notions that I think are good for you to get. If you are interested in finding out everything that's in my notions bag and a really in-depth discussion as to why my preferences are what they are, I do have a video of me going through my notions bag that I will link up here. But this, I'm just going to give you kind of just, the greatest hits. Here's what I like. This here is a big-eyed tapestry needle, so it's very easy to get your yarn through this. When you knit, you have to cast on, you have to bind off, you also sometimes have to join a new ball of yarn into your work. All those things create tails. And when you're finished knitting, you need to take those tails and weave them into your work. And that's where a tapestry needle is really indispensable, even for new knitters. I would get a set of embroidery scissors if you don't already have a pair. And you do want embroidery scissors because you want that nice pointed tip. You need to cut your yarn on occasion, and especially with those tails, after you weave them in, you a lot of times want to snip them very close to the fabric, and you need a nice pointed tip for this. Next thing that I think is indispensable for even a beginning knitter is a tape measure and ruler. I've talked a little bit about gauge. Gauge, of course, is the number of stitches per inch that you create through a combination of the knitting needle and the yarn. That's how I've described it. But in truth, you create gauge through a combination of the knitting needle, the yarn, and the knitter. And so when you're knitting, you need to check your own gauge. You also need a cloth tape measure in your notions bag because at some point you may want to knit a hat or a sock or a sweater. And in those instances, you need to measure body parts. For that, you're going to need a cloth tape measure. So tape measure, ruler, really good to have with you in your notions bag. In your knitting life, there will be mistakes. There will be dropped stitches. There will be twisted stitches that need to be fixed. Things will happen. What you need in those moments in your life is a good crochet hook. I have a couple of different options for your notions bag. This is just a single crochet hook. It's a size F. A size F or H will work very nicely with worsted weighted yarn. And yeah, this is just a basic crochet hook. I've had this in my notions bag forever. I mean that. This is the first crochet hook I ever bought. And I've used it many, many times to fix many, many mistakes. But there's an even better option. These are double-ended crochet hooks. These are marketed to knitters as being used to repair garter stitch. What is garter stitch? So there's two stitches in knitting. There's the knit stitch and there's the purl stitch. Garter stitch is the most basic stitch pattern any knitter creates, and it's just a fabric that's made up of all knit stitches. The thing with garter stitch, for reasons we will eventually get into, is they can be a little tricky to repair, and double-ended crochet hooks make that repair work very easy. That being said, you can use double-ended crochet hooks to repair any kind of stitch pattern. So I just think this is a really versatile tool. They will come in a pack of 3 so that you have a hook that's appropriately sized for fine yarns, for medium weight yarns like worsted weighted yarns, and for your bulkier yarns. If I had a choice between a regular crochet hook or double-ended crochet hooks, I'd get the double-ended crochet hooks. I recommended first-time knitters to get straight needles. If you're going to get straight needles, you'll want to get this. These are point protectors, and they just go on the tip of the needle like this. And that's really important because when you put your work down, I don't know how. When I first started knitting, I didn't have children and I didn't have pets. And I would put this needle down with my work on it and I would come back and the work had fallen off. Like, I don't know if there's just little like anti-knitting gremlins that would come in and try to mess up my job, but that was all solved with a point protector. Last but not least, in terms of notions, are stitch markers. I am very passionate about my stitch markers. This is called a locking stitch marker. It's just a plastic safety pin, but the reason I like these is you can close them, and then it just acts like a ring that you can hang off your needle, but you can also use these to mark off specific stitches. Let's say you see a mistake in your work, like a twisted stitch. You can mark that with one of these so that you know you don't lose track of where you need to do that repair. Also, you can drop a stitch, and that stitch will fall down and unravel, and you get a ladder in the work. You can secure that rogue stitch with a locking stitch marker. So this is just a really versatile tool to have. The other kind of stitch marker I really like is this. This is just a coilless safety pin. I like these even more actually than the locking stitch marker because they're smaller, so they're a little less obtrusive when you're knitting. These you can find at any chain craft store. These can be a little trickier to find. You certainly can find them online, and frankly, they're very inexpensive, and I would get both. If you have any questions about what I've said today, please ask them in the comments below. I'd be happy to answer them. You can also find me on social media, which is in the description box. I am on Ravelry, Twitter, and Instagram. I hope that you found this video helpful in starting your knitting journey, and if so, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. That really does help the YouTube algorithm know that I am a channel worth people checking out, and I really am wanting to grow this channel in 2020. That's my New Year's resolution. My New Year's resolution is to keep growing this YouTube channel. By the way, the next video in the series is going to be all about casting on, and if you are an experienced knitter, I think you're going to want to check that video out because it's going to be all about mastering the long tail cast on. So I'm going to dive in deep. I'm not going to just show you how to do a long tail cast on. I'm going to be diving in deep in terms of its structure and how it works, and I think there's going to be great information for first-time knitters and more experienced knitters. So if you want to know when that video is coming, hit subscribe and the notification bell, which will let you know whenever I upload a new video. I hope that you have a wonderful day, evening, weekend, whenever you may be watching this, and as always, happy knitting. Bye! The third type of knitting needle that you find is, oh, let me get it out. Yes. So, whether you're a new knitter, when it comes to fiber, what kind of fiber is good for a first-time beginner knitter? First-time beginner knitter. That's a little repetitive, isn't it? I just filled my wrap up and realized I didn't record the audio. Technical problems. Apparently, there's an anti-carry gremlin running around. But that being said, I know the first time I went to a... I know when...